Some towns fade into history, but Ardeleni did not simply vanish. It was swallowed by a darkness no one could explain, leaving only whispers and half-forgotten memories behind. Chapter 1. The Letter. In the autumn of 1976, a London-based journalist named Edward Clark received a letter unlike any other. It was written in shaky French, the ink smudged as though the writer's hand trembled while writing. The letter came from a man named Henri Duval, a retired schoolteacher from northern France. The words were haunting. "You do not know me, Monsieur Clark, but I must beg you to come. My town, Ardeleni, is disappearing. People are vanishing one by one. The church bells ring at night when no one dares to touch them. The mayor tells us nothing, and the authorities dismiss us as fools. But I know this will not stop. Soon there will be nothing left of us. Soon there will be no Ardeleni at all." Edward had spent his career chasing forgotten tragedies. Mining accidents, unsolved murders, towns struck by famine and erased from maps. Yet something about Henri's words gnawed at him. The tone was not hysteria. It was quiet resignation, as though the writer already knew his fate. After days of restless sleep, Edward booked a ferry to France. He carried only his leather satchel, his notebook, and his stubborn conviction that some stories must be told, even when no one wants to hear them. When he asked around in Paris about Ardeleni, most people frowned and shook their heads. Some said they had never heard of it. Others lowered their voices and muttered, "Leave it be. That place is not for outsiders." By the time Edward boarded the final train that would take him north, he felt more like a trespasser than a journalist. The countryside grew darker, quieter, and the town smaller. On the map, Ardeleni was barely a dot, yet the name carried an unease he could not explain, as though he were tracing the outline of something that should not exist. The closer he got, the heavier the air became, cold, damp, and filled with the scent of rotting leaves. The train conductor, a wrinkled man with eyes that seemed far older than his years, glanced at Edward's ticket and whispered, "You are going to Ardeleni? Then God help you." When Edward finally stepped onto the lonely platform of a half-abandoned station, the wind carried with it the sound of distant bells, faint, uneven, and hollow. Bells that should not have been ringing, and in that moment, Edward Clark knew. He had entered a story that might never let him leave. Chapter 2. The Silent Inn. The road to Ardeleni twisted through forests that seemed untouched by time. Edward walked the last stretch on foot, his shoes crunching over damp gravel. The moon was rising, pale and cold, casting silver shadows over the crooked houses that lined the narrow streets. There was no welcome, no sound of laughter, no sign of life, only shutters nailed shut and doors barred from within. At the center of the town stood a small inn, its wooden sign faded and cracked, swinging in the chill wind. A single candle burned in the window, the only sign of warmth Edward had seen since his arrival. Pushing the door open, he stepped inside. The air smelled of old wood, smoke, and something faintly metallic, like blood. Behind the counter, a woman with sharp eyes and gray-streaked hair regarded him cautiously. "You are not from here," she said flatly, her French clipped. "No," Edward replied, setting down his satchel. "I'm here to meet Henri Duval. He wrote to me at the sound of the name." The woman stiffened. For a moment her lips parted as though to speak, but she only shook her head and muttered, "Then you are too late." Edward's heart tightened. "What do you mean?" The innkeeper's eyes darted to the door, then to the staircase above. "Henry was found 3 nights ago, by the church. They say he disappeared. No body. Only his shoes, left neatly at the foot of the bell tower." Edward felt a chill crawl down his spine. "Disappeared? How can a man vanish without a trace?" The woman leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Monsieur Clark, you should leave. No good comes to strangers who stay in Ardeleni. The bells call at night, and those who hear them do not return." Before Edward could ask more, the sound cut through the silence. A single chime from the church tower, deep and hollow. It was not yet midnight, and yet the bells were ringing. The woman froze, her eyes wide with fear. "Do not answer them," she hissed. "Do not go near." But Edward, driven by equal parts fear and curiosity, moved to the window. Through the glass, he could see the outline of the church at the far end of the square, its shadow stretching like a claw across the empty cobblestones. Another chime echoed, longer, heavier, like the groan of something ancient and restless. And in that moment, Edward saw it, a figure moving between the graves near the churchyard. It was tall, cloaked, and slow, drifting as though the ground itself carried it forward. The bells rang again. The figure stopped, turned its faceless head toward the inn, and lingered. Edward stepped back from the window, his breath shallow. The innkeeper crossed herself, her face pale as ash. "Now you have seen," she whispered. "And once you have seen, Monsieur, Ardeleni will not let you go." Chapter 3. The Bell Tower. The night air pressed heavily against the windows of the inn. Edward barely slept. Each time his eyes closed, the echo of the bells seemed to ripple through his skull, dragging him back into a restless wakefulness. By dawn, he resolved he could not leave without answers. The square outside was empty, but the church loomed at the far end, its stone walls blackened with age. Edward approached cautiously, his breath clouding in the morning chill. The great doors of the church were shut, but the bell tower door, low and narrow, stood slightly ajar. He stepped inside. The air was damp, thick with the smell of mildew and dust. A spiral staircase wound upwards, carved from stone worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. As Edward climbed, faint scratches caught his eye on the wall, strange marks carved deep into the stone. Not letters, not numbers, symbols, spirals, and jagged lines that seemed to writhe if stared at too long. Halfway up, he found something that stopped him cold. A shoe, old, weathered, but still intact. Next to it, pressed into the dust, was the faint impression of bare feet leading higher into the tower. His hand trembled as he touched the worn leather. Henri's shoes. The higher he climbed, the colder it became, as though the air itself resisted him. At last Edward reached the bell chamber. The massive bronze bell hung silent in its wooden frame, green with corrosion. Yet the air around it vibrated faintly, as if the bell had only just rung. On the wooden beams were more carvings, deeper this time. Edward leaned closer. They resembled faces, hollow, twisted, screaming, etched into the very heart of the wood. A sudden gust of wind burst through the open archway, and with it came a sound not from the bell, but from the walls themselves, a low, resonant hum. Edward staggered back, clutching his ears. The hum grew louder, shaping itself into words he could barely comprehend. A chorus of whispers. "Stay, stay, stay." Edward stumbled toward the staircase, but his foot caught against something hidden beneath the bell. A journal. Its leather cover was cracked, its pages yellowed. The name etched into it froze his blood. Henri Duval. Before Edward could open it, the bell above shuddered. Though no rope was pulled, it swung gently, then harder, the metal groaning. The sound that followed was not a chime, but a scream, deep, raw, and unearthly. Edward fled down the spiral stairs, clutching the journal. Behind him, the bell's cry reverberated through the stones of Ardeleni, spilling out across the square, waking the silent town. And this time, from the shadows of the alleyways, figures began to move. Chapter 4. The Journal of Henri Duval. Edward burst out of the church, the chilling scream of the bell still rattling in his chest. The square was no longer empty. Shapes moved in the mist, silent and deliberate. He clutched the worn journal to his chest and ran back to the inn, slamming the door behind him. Inside, the air felt just as oppressive as outside, but at least the walls kept the fog at bay. He lit a lantern and opened the journal with trembling fingers. The first page bore Henri's neat handwriting, dated 6 months earlier, the very time he had gone missing. "Ardeleni is not dead," Henri had written. "It only pretends to be." Edward's hands shook as he turned the pages. Henri described the first nights he spent in the town. The silence, the vanishing footprints in the mud, the way shadows seemed to lean toward him when he walked. He had heard the bells too, long before anyone else mentioned them. But then, the entries grew darker. Henri wrote of following figures into the woods beyond the town, of hearing his own name whispered from the bell tower, of dreams so vivid he awoke with scratches across his arms. On the final page, Henri's writing was frantic. The ink smudged. "The town feeds on us. The bells are not warnings. They are calls. Each chime takes something from me. Memory, strength, will. I feel myself slipping. If I disappear, I will not be gone. I will belong to it. If anyone finds this, leave Ardeleni. Do not search for me. A sudden knock on the door made Edward jump, nearly dropping the lantern. His pulse hammered in his ears. He approached the door slowly, every instinct screaming to remain silent. Another knock, louder this time. Edward tightened his grip on the journal. Against his better judgment, he opened the door. No one was there, only the fog. But just as he moved to close it, he noticed something carved into the wood of the doorframe, freshly scratched as if by fingernails. A single word. Stay! Chapter 5, Whispers in the Fog. Edward did not sleep that night. The word stay burned in his mind like a command he could not ignore. The journal lay open on the table, its final words etched into his thoughts. The inn felt less like a refuge now, and more like a trap. Near midnight, he heard it again. The bells. But this time, they did not echo from the tower. They sounded closer, as though someone carried them through the streets, each chime dragging through the mist. Edward rose, lantern in hand, and stepped to the window. Shapes moved again, half hidden by fog. Tall, gaunt figures, their faces obscured, drifting silently past the inn. None of them left footprints. One of them turned its head toward his window, and Edward stumbled back. Though he could not see the face, he knew, deep in his bones, it was watching him. Then came the whisper. Not outside. Inside. Edward! He spun around, the lantern shaking in his hand. No one was there, yet the whisper continued, brushing past his ear, curling around the room like smoke. Edward, don't leave. We need you. The voice was wrong, too smooth, too calm. It sounded almost like Henri, yet hollow, drained of life. Edward grabbed the journal and pressed it to his chest as though it could shield him. He whispered back, desperate, "Where are you, Henri?" For a long moment, silence. Then a reply. "In the fog." The lantern flickered, then went out, plunging the inn into darkness. And from outside, the bell tolled once more. Chapter 6. The Silent Procession. The following evening, Edward's resolve faltered. He had intended to leave Ardeleni at first light, yet something held him in place. Whether it was fear, curiosity, or the pull of Henry's journal, he could not say. As dusk fell, he ventured once more into the mist-shrouded streets. The fog seemed heavier now, suffocating, pressing against his skin like damp cloth. The town was still, eerily still, until a faint glow appeared at the far end of the street. Edward froze. Lanterns, dozens of them, floating forward in perfect silence. Beneath each light, figures marched, tall and spectral, their faces concealed by pale veils. They moved in perfect unison, their steps making no sound. At the head of the procession was a figure taller than the rest, carrying a crooked staff. The bells rang, not from the tower, but from the figures themselves. Each step released a soft chime, as though the sound came from inside their bodies. Edward pressed himself into a doorway, heart pounding. The figures drifted past him, and though their faces were hidden, he felt the weight of countless unseen eyes. He dared not breathe. Then one figure slowed, turned its veiled head toward him, lifted a pale hand. "Join us," the voice said, low, unearthly, and many voices at once. Edward fled back to the inn, slamming the door shut, but the sound of the bells followed him all the way. Chapter 7. The Forbidden Chapel. The next morning, Edward forced himself to search for answers. The journal spoke of a place where all paths end, the chapel. It was the only lead he had. He found it at the edge of town, a ruined chapel swallowed by ivy, its doors hanging crooked on rusted hinges. The air around it was colder, heavier, as if the fog itself was afraid to enter. Inside, the chapel was little more than a skeleton. Broken pews, shattered windows, the altar cracked down the middle. Yet faint symbols were carved into the walls. Spirals, eyes, and bells, always bells. Edward's hand brushed against one carving. The stone was warm. Suddenly, the room shifted. Shadows thickened, and the air filled with whispers, overlapping and frantic. You shouldn't be here. It's too late now. Stay. At the altar, Edward noticed something glinting beneath the dust, a key blackened with age. As he reached for it, the whispers rose into a shriek. The chapel doors slammed shut behind him, and then, through the broken window, he saw them, the procession, watching, waiting. Chapter 8, The Key and the Echo. Edward's trembling hand closed around the ancient key. The instant his fingers touched the corroded metal, a deep vibration shuddered through the chapel floor, rattling the broken pews. It wasn't merely a sound, it was a pulse, a heartbeat buried beneath stone. The whispers twisted into chants, layered and relentless, overlapping until Edward could no longer tell which voice belonged to his mind and which to the walls around him. The door. The door must be opened. Edward staggered back, clutching the key. His gaze darted to the altar, where cracks in the stone glowed faintly with an otherworldly light, as though something beneath was straining to break free. Suddenly, the chapel doors burst open, not from his push, but as if they had been pulled outward. The procession stood beyond the threshold, their lanterns blazing brighter than before. The tall figure at their head lifted its crooked staff, and for a moment, Edward swore the bells inside their bodies fell silent. The silence was worse than the sound. It pressed into his skull, suffocating him. Then all at once the bells tolled in unison. Edward fled, the key heavy in his palm, the sound of the bells hammering against his chest like war drums. He did not look back, not even once. Yet he knew they were following. Chapter 9, The Innkeeper's Secret. Edward staggered back into the inn, gasping for air. The common room was empty, save for the innkeeper polishing a glass at the counter. His calmness felt unnatural, almost mocking. "You saw them," the innkeeper said flatly, without looking up. Edward froze. "You know about them?" The innkeeper finally raised his eyes. They were pale, almost colorless. "Everyone here does, but few survive long enough to speak of it." Edward slammed the key on the counter. What does it open?" The man recoiled slightly as though the sight of it pained him. He whispered, "That key is not meant for you. It binds what should remain buried." Edward leaned closer, desperation in his voice. "Then tell me what's happening in this town." The innkeeper glanced toward the door, lowering his voice. "The bells are not just sounds. They are invitations. Each toll calls another soul into the procession. Once you hear them enough, you cannot resist. That is why Henri came. That is why he stayed." Edward's heart sank. Henri hadn't been trapped here. He had answered the call. Before Edward could respond, a faint chiming filled the inn. Not from outside, from upstairs. The innkeeper's face drained of all color. "They're here." Chapter 10. Upstairs. The chime from above grew sharper, clearer, as though the ceiling itself had become a bell. Dust rained down from the rafters with every strike. Edward's hand shook as he reached for the staircase rail, but the innkeeper grabbed his wrist. "Don't," the old man whispered. His voice was trembling now, stripped of all calm. "Once you see them inside, you'll never leave." But Edward tore free. Henri's name burned in his mind, louder than the bells. He had to know. Each step upward creaked like bone splintering. The second-floor hallway stretched longer than it should have, impossibly long. Every door stood ajar, every room dark, shadows spilling out like ink. From the far end of the corridor, faint lantern lights swayed. The procession was waiting. Edward froze. The tall figure at the front bowed its head, the bells inside the congregation swaying in rhythm. And from one of the open rooms, a familiar voice drifted out. "Edward! Henri!" The sound was so soft, so broken, yet it pierced Edward deeper than the bells ever could. He stepped forward, ignoring the procession, drawn to the voice. His hand pushed the door open, and inside in the darkness, something stirred. Not Henri, something wearing his face. Chapter 11, The False Face. The thing in the room smiled with Henri's lips. Its eyes glistened like wet glass, but there was no warmth in them, only a hollow echo of life. "Edward," it whispered again, stepping into the pale lantern light. The resemblance was flawless. Henri's cheekbones, the scar above his brow from their student days. But the way it moved was wrong. Each gesture bent too far, lingered too long, as though its body was a puppet pulled by invisible strings. Edward staggered back. "You're not him!" The figure tilted its head, the bells from the corridor chiming in unison with the movement. "Does it matter?" it asked softly. "We wear the faces you need to see. Henri, your brother, even yourself. That's why no one leaves Ardeleni." The doors along the hallway creaked wider. Shadows spilled further into the corridor. The procession of pale figures began advancing, their lanterns swaying in rhythm, as if to push Edward toward the false Henri. Edward's breath quickened. His mind screamed to run, but his feet refused. The creature leaned closer, its voice dropping to a rasp. "Stay, Edward. We've been waiting." And then it smiled wider, too wide, splitting the skin where Henri's face should have been. To watch on Chapter 12, the escape attempt, Edward's pulse hammered in his ears as the false Henri's smile widened into something grotesque. He stumbled backward, his shoulders striking the wooden frame of the corridor door. The pale procession was closing in, their lanterns swaying in perfect unison, as if each step pulled tighter the noose around him. "No," Edward muttered, forcing his breath steady. "I will not be part of this." With sudden resolve, he hurled the lantern in his hand at the false Henri. The glass shattered, flames erupting across the warped floorboards. For the first time, the creature's calm mask cracked, its borrowed face convulsed in a twisted rage. The flames spread quickly, and in the confusion, Edward darted through a gap in the procession. Cold hands reached for him, brushing his coat, clutching at his sleeves, but he tore free, sprinting down the corridor. Behind him, the bells tolled wildly, as though the town itself was warning of his rebellion. Windows shuttered, shutters slammed open, and more pale figures spilled into the streets, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Edward burst into the night air, lungs burning, heart pounding. The square loomed ahead, empty yet alive with whispers. The cobblestones seemed to shift beneath his feet, leading him away from the road out of Ardeleni. "No!" he roared, forcing himself toward the eastern path where he remembered the forest lay. Every step felt heavier, as though unseen hands were dragging him back, but he pushed forward, driven by a single truth. If he stayed, he would never leave. And yet, from the corner of his eye, he saw the false Henri step unharmed through the flames, following him, its face still smiling through the firelight. Chapter 13. Into the Forest. Edward stumbled out of the haunted square, his lungs burning from exertion, his heart hammering against his ribs like a frantic drum. The night air pressed in on him, thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. Every step toward the edge of the forest seemed heavier than the last, as if unseen hands were tugging at him, urging him to turn back. The trees ahead were gnarled and ancient, their skeletal branches reaching across the narrow path like clawed fingers. The fog, dense and swirling, coiled around his legs, slowing him, wrapping him in an almost tangible, suffocating embrace. Yet Edward's determination surged. He could not, would not, allow himself to become another lost soul of Ardeleni. Not Henri, not himself. A faint glimmer appeared through the mist, and Edward paused. Moonlight revealed a small clearing, and in the center lay a weathered stone cross, half buried in moss. On its base, faint etchings spelled a warning. Those who ignore the call choose freedom, yet every step taken is watched. Edward swallowed, his mouth dry. He glanced over his shoulder and caught movement within the shadows. Figures, the pale, gaunt shapes of the vanished townsfolk, drifted among the trees, silent, patient, eyes gleaming like lanterns in the dark. The sight made his stomach churn, but he forced himself forward. "Henri," he whispered, his voice barely carrying over the forest floor. "Where are you?" A voice answered him from the gloom, soft and distant, layered with an unnatural resonance. In the fog, we are inside you." Edward ran faster, each step a battle against roots that seemed to twist themselves around his feet. The fog thickened, turning the forest into a labyrinth of shadows and whispers, yet he refused to stop. Somewhere ahead, there had to be a way out, or a way to end the nightmare that was Ardeleni. Chapter 14. The Heart of the Bell. Eventually, Edward broke into a larger clearing. At its center rose an ancient bell tower, older than any church he had ever seen, its stones blackened with age and vines crawling across its crumbling walls. The bell hung ominously at the top, swaying slightly as if the tower itself were alive. Edward's footsteps echoed as he approached, the crunch of dead leaves like brittle whispers beneath his boots. Henry's voice called out from somewhere within the tower, strained and frightened. "Edward, help me!" With a trembling hand, Edward pushed open the creaking wooden door. Inside, the air was cold and heavy, scented with dust and the faint metallic tang of rust. The spiral staircase, broken in places, wound upward into darkness. Each step brought a sense of vertigo, as though the stones themselves were bending, distorting the space around him. Reaching the top, Edward found himself in the bell chamber. The bell was enormous, its surface scored with centuries of use, yet it trembled as if it were straining to ring. And beneath it, trapped in some spectral snare, were the faces of the missing townsfolk, pressed into the stone and wood, hollow eyes staring out in silent plea. Henri's pale, worn face emerged from the mass, recognition and terror mingling in his gaze. Edward gripped the blackened key he had found and turned it in the lock embedded at the bell's base. A deafening toll filled the chamber, reverberating through his bones. The spectral faces writhed, contorting as if released from invisible chains. Shadows and light collided in the air, and for a fleeting moment, Edward felt the pull of the bell's power attempting to consume him too. "Henri, take my hand!" Edward shouted. Their fingers met, and the room shuddered violently. Light tore through the cracks in the bell chamber, and the imprisoned faces dissolved into the ether. The bell ceased its tolling. The oppressive weight that had pressed down upon the forest seemed to lift. But as Edward exhaled in relief, he noticed something chilling. The bell still moved slightly, casting a long dark shadow across the clearing. Even though Ardeleni's heart had faltered, its echo lingered. Chapter 15. The Last Toll. The sun rose as Edward and Henri finally staggered out of the forest, exhausted but alive. The dense mist had begun to dissipate, revealing an empty landscape. Ardeleni was gone, erased from the earth as though it had never existed. Yet Edward felt a lingering chill in his bones, a quiet, insistent hum that whispered of the town's persistent, unseen presence. Henri's voice was soft but resolute. "Edward, we survived, but Ardeleni, it is still out there." Somewhere, waiting, Edward sank to a fallen log, opening his notebook. His hands shook as he wrote, feverishly, detailing every terror, every bell toll, every vanishing figure. Words were the only barrier he could erect against Ardeleni's insatiable hunger. From deep within the distant tree line, a solitary bell tolled once more. Its sound was hollow, empty, but unmistakable. Edward froze, pen hovering, knowing that the town's dark pulse would forever echo in the world. Yet despite the lingering terror, Edward wrote on. For some calls can only be silenced by remembrance, some horrors only by witnessing. And as he wrote, the sun broke through the horizon, spilling warm light over the misty remnants of a town that should not exist, but did in memory and in shadow forever.